that women in science were not being recognized the way they should. They were not receiving the attention that they should have or the respect. And somebody brought up the fact that there were no pictures of women in the halls at Cold Spring Harbor, and would I call and find out why? Do you recall? And I remember having visited, and I think I saw Barbara McClintock, but now I'm not sure. Certainly not in the hall. Maybe in the dining room. Well, anyhow, I know she was there, but I didn't see any others. So we didn't report on it or anything like that, but, you know, it was just noted, and you remained on the list of people that we wanted to hear from about women at Cold Spring Harbor. Well, since that time, I found out, by the way, that 50% of the graduate students and over 50% of the people that come to attend the meetings now are women. Is that right? And that Barbara was one of 8 Nobel laureates that have worked at Cold Spring Harbor. And I think it's important that we hear more about what's going on at this very prestigious institute, because they are not a medical school or affiliated with a medical school as the way many of universities are. And they have wonderful support in their community and wonderful support from an international audience. And I felt that since Joe is not here to introduce you properly, that Rita Caldwell will talk about your tremendous personal achievements. So I'm going to give Rita the microphone now.
It's quite a pleasure to introduce Bruce, and I'm not going to go through all of his wonderful achievements. Instead, I'm just going to speak personally. Bruce is an Aussie. He's an Australian, and I happen to love Australia. He's a graduate of the University of Sydney and John Curtin School of Medical Research. I happen to be an honorary professor at the University of Queensland, and I think if you ever get to know an Australian, he's one of the best of the breed, so to speak. The other aspect of John that I think is fascinating is that his interest is in the duplication of chromosomes and the process. Now, I'm on the board of the University of Tokyo, and the president was bemoaning the fact that they're having difficulty getting women to attend the university. And I pointed out to the president that if they didn't make an effort to bring women into science and provide jobs for them, that they had 2 alternatives. That one would be to import from Korea and China and India. And if you know, Japan is a very insular society, so that's not so terrific. And then I told him that, you know, the alternative is to educate that 51% of your population who are women. And I'm afraid that I was terribly bold and crude, as I usually am, and I said, you know, sir, the Y chromosome does not carry the intelligence genes. In fact, it doesn't carry very many genes. So maybe you can tell us about the X and Y chromosome, Bruce. In any case, it's a pleasure to introduce Bruce. He is an extraordinary individual. He is the president of Cold Spring Harbor. But again, I have to tweak you because we, the Rosalind Franklin Society, cannot be happier to have you as president, since you succeeded someone, was it Jim Watson, I think it was. So the accomplishments you can read in the booklet, but let me just say that we're very lucky to have Bruce to speak with us tonight. He's a champion scientist and a champion for women in science. Bruce.
Well, thank you, Rita, and thank you to Marion and the Society for asking me to come and talk. I had said no last year, and actually because I literally had a time conflict last year, but I didn't have this year, and I'm actually glad I'm here. I enjoyed the talks this afternoon, particularly the ones that are not related to my fields, and that's one great thing about science. when I was thinking about what to talk about, I was thinking, am I here to get grilled about, what my predecessor has done before? And it so happens that we just republished Jim's famous book, The Double Helix, and so I dared bring a copy of this to the Rosalind Franklin Society. Here it is here. It's an annotated version, and I wanted to tell you a little bit about it because I think it says something about how perceptions about people and how history has a way of changing things a little bit. But Rosalind really should be remembered for the fantastic science she did, and I think Aaron Klug has probably pointed that out better than anybody else. Not only was she involved in the collection of data and analysis of fibers of DNA that really led to the elucidation of the structure of double helix of DNA, but later on her work on viruses and that she could have won, had she lived, could have won actually 2 Nobel Prizes, I think. Aaron Klug won the Nobel Prize for his work that I think Rosalind had a lot to do with, and about the double helix. This book came about because Jim had published this book in 1968 and was criticized, I think, for the way he treated almost everybody in the book, including himself, actually. I reread this book. I read it when I was an undergraduate, and I reread it when we published it with Simon & Schuster. And it struck me that Jim was very self-deprecating in that book. In the book, he really and he criticized and made fairly blunt comments about everybody, including himself. And I think that was one of the refreshing things about the book, that almost all of the players in this story did not want the book published. And all of those a lot of the letters about the publication of the book are actually in the book now, including some very interesting letters between Jim and Francis Crick about Francis was opposed to publishing this book. But in rereading it struck me that actually Jim did not know Rosalind Franklin very well during the period of time of this discovery. They only met a few times. And yet, later on, they became good friends before Rosalind died. And Francis Crick became very good friends with Rosalind. And I think that says a lot about how the science ended up playing out. We ended up doing this because Sidney Brenner gave his archives to Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory, which is an interesting thing in itself, that somebody who's a Nobel laureate spent all of his time at a very famous laboratory in England, the Laboratory of Molecular Biology. There was nobody there interested in keeping the archives of the founders of the field of molecular biology. And so we have an archive center at Cold Spring Harbor, which is, I think, a very important archive, given some people who have been at Cold Spring Harbor. And we decided to build a building, an extension onto our library, and house the important archives of the founders of molecular biology. The Wellcome Trust, we did not have $2 million to get Francis Crick's archives, and the Wellcome Trust actually purchased that from a person who had previously bought a lot of Francis's material. But there was some stuff missing between the important years of 1951 to 1965. This was the years 1953 was the discovery of the double helix, and in the early 60s was the elucidation of the genetic code, which Francis was a critical player in. And he had told Horace Judson, who wrote the definitive history of the molecular biology, in the 8th Day of Creation, he had told Horace that his secretary, an overzealous secretary, had thrown out all of his archives and letters. Well, it turned out that they were in Sidney Brenner's archives. They had been mixed up because Sidney and Francis shared an office for many, many years. When we got Sidney's archives, 2 of our scientists, Alex Gann and Jan Watalski, at Sydney's suggestion, so Sydney knew this, started looking through these archives and found letters to Francis Crick and then a lot of copies of Francis Crick's correspondence to others, including an extraordinarily interesting correspondence between Maurice Wilkins and Francis, which was the impetus for writing, for republishing this book with an annotated version. So that many of the letters, and particularly the letters from Maurice Wilkins to Francis about that era, during that time when Rosalind worked at King's College, and in another lesson I learned from rereading this book is that science leaders should probably stay out of trying to manage science, because I think actually the real problem that Rosalind and Maurice Wilkins had was caused not by them, but by John Randall, who was the head of King's College, the research center at King's College. Randall had hired Wilkins, and Wilkins was working on DNA, and then Wilkins went on vacation, and during his absence, and Ray Gosling worked with Wilkins, and then during Wilkins went off on vacation, and during that time Randall wrote to Rosalind Franklin and said she could come to King's and work on DNA exclusively, and Ray Gosling would work with her. And so when Wilkins came back, he was not completely told the whole story, but wondered why this woman was suddenly showing up and with his research assistant working on all of this stuff that he was previously working on. And this was all orchestrated by the leader of that organization. So the lesson for people like me is stay out of trying to manage science.
Tell us the lesson and don't go on vacation.
Well, yes, well, I wouldn't recommend that. So it turned out to be an extremely interesting story. I think in looking at the history of this, and I think many of you know this very well, I think Rosalind's sister got most of it right in the end, that she said that Jim probably unfairly, or definitely unfairly, treated Rosalind, and she was not like he characterized her, but this was Jim's perception. Jim wrote this book about his perception of that particular time, and as I think it's clear that he did not really know Rosalind very well during that period of time. They'd only met a few times. And he heard all about her from Maurice Wilkins from these letters that are now published in this book. And so it's an interesting piece of history, but and even in the epilogue of the book, Jim actually says that he did mischaracterize Rosalind Franklin. And so that's one thing, the main thing I'm going to say about this, but there are a lot of lessons to be learned from looking at the history of science. But jumping to the present, we're now 60 years later after the events of 1953, and I find myself, I went to Cold Spring Harbor from Australia to do a 2-year postdoc, fully intending to go back to Australia, and through unexpected events and meeting the person who's now my wife, I ended up staying in the United States and ended up staying at Cold Spring Harbor for the entire time. I was fortunate to do that because the Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory is a fantastic place to work. And little did I know that I would end up been offered the opportunity to succeed Jim as director, and it comes with, or president now, we call the position president, and it comes with an enormous amount of responsibility, not just because of the science, but because of the science education, which is what I want to talk about. We were founded as an educational institution in 1890 to teach science to scientists. And that mission predated the research, which really only got underway in a serious way in 1902, when we were the first institution in the United States to focus on genetics. Charles Davenport, who was the director then, had the vision, when Mendel's laws were republished in 1990 in Europe, had the vision of trying to explain Darwinian evolution in Mendelian terms, and wrote a beautiful grant that I read to the Carnegie Institution of Washington to propose this idea. The word genetics hadn't even been coined in 1902. It was coined in 1905 by Bateson, and so he called it experimental evolution. And that was the idea that you could try and understand Darwin's inheritance units in terms of the quantitative traits that Mendel had originally discovered and were rediscovered by Hugo de Vries, whom Davenport tried to recruit from Europe and didn't succeed, but actually he ended up recruiting some really fantastic people. The laboratory's been focused on genetics ever since, and perhaps the most famous of those people is Barbara McClintock, who was at laboratory for 50 years. Ended up at Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory because she could not stand working under a male department chair who controlled when she could work. And so she told me that she would pretend to leave at 5 o'clock when the guy locked the botany building, and then she would go round the back and wait for him to leave and climb up the second floor on a trellis and go back to work. One day he found her doing this, and they had an argument, and she literally got in her car and drove to New York and never went back there. She ended up at Cold Spring Harbor in 1941 and did most of her important work, although she was very famous before for work that she did before that. My laboratory for many years was next to Barbara's, and I knew her very well. And when Jim asked me to if I would consider taking the directorship after he stepped down in that position, I went to Barbara because I knew her very well and asked her whether she thought this was a good idea, and she said absolutely not. And I just had lunch a few weeks ago in London with John Cairns, who was Jim Watson's predecessor at Cold Spring Harbor, and John told me that that Barbara hated directors absolutely with a passion. She did not like Jim because he was director, and now I know why she told me I shouldn't become director at Cold Spring Harbor. But it's been an interesting time. Our other main mission, in addition to research, which we do in cancer and neuroscience and plant biology and quantitative biology, is science education. And I want to talk about that and in the context of, a little bit in the context of women in science. But Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory now teaches science from 7th grade all the way to teaching Nobel laureates. And I will try and explain how we do that. And these are not in the order of the individual programs that were established, the historical order, but they're in chronological order as one goes through one's life, thinking about education and science education. In 1998, David Miklos, who is still director of what we call the DNA Learning Center at Cold Spring Harbor, started bringing school children to Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory to essentially as field trips to explain some science that we were doing. And that resulted in us eventually buying a school, which we own, and then creating that school into really the first and large program in science education in genetics in the world. And that school, the principal focus of that DNA Learning Center is in genetics and molecular biology, which was what the lab does. We have we develop lab curriculum, so we take experiments that scientists do and convert those into relatively simple things that children, even at the 7th grade, can understand. A very good example, and I know that not everybody are biologists here, but a very good example is that one of the classic genetic tests in bacterial genetics is called alpha complementation, where you can make bacteria blue by adding an inducer of the lac system. And And this involves some very, very complicated genetics, and it was done like that to make things easier for geneticists, and of course there was a history of accumulated baggage in all of this genetics, which if you try to explain it to an undergraduate, it's almost impossible for them to understand why scientists would actually do this. And so what the DNA Learning Center did is just go right back to the beginning and simplify the whole thing and clone everything into one plasmid with one gene instead of doing complementation. And they called the plasmid P blue, and if you put this plasmid into bacteria, they would turn blue. Now they do it with green fluorescent protein from jellyfish. And now we have experiments because of next-gen sequencing where children can come in even in the 8th grade and take a swab of DNA cells from their cheek, isolate with PCR a polymorphic locus from mitochondria and sequence that, and then they get given this information back when they're in their classrooms, and they do a whole semester of curricula around this, which involves comparing their DNA sequence to other kids in their class, to a national database which has nearly 1 million children's entries into it now, and also comparing their DNA to chimpanzee and Neanderthal and all sorts of other things, and also ethnic groups. And if you just think about that one very simple experiment, you can teach about evolution, you can teach about population distributions, you can teach about ethnicity and genetics, and you can teach about molecular biology, about DNA, and about almost everything that you want. The kids look at their cells when they take them out under a microscope. And so this is a very powerful way of teaching. We also have, we teach teachers as well, and so one of the biggest programs we have is actually during the summers, and also through a program where we have sending out teachers across the country and in fact around the world, as you'll see, teach science teachers in schools, and these academic field trips. We also help, we have summer camps for kids, and we also we have a large multimedia program where we raise a lot of money and develop internet sites. And I was interested in hearing Dominique talk today about, you know, the fact that men are looking on the internet and women are traditionally reading newspapers, but kids are all on the internet, and the thing we're concerned about is what they're reading needs to be correct. And so we've provided now 21 different websites, from genetics to cancer to neuroscience, and we even have iPhone and iPad apps. You can get a 3D brain, or you can get a primer on genetic diseases, and other iPad and iPhone apps from the DNA Learning Center, and all of this is free. All of the websites and all of the phone apps are for free, so kids are using these. To give you an example, in 1988 we had 6,000 students in the first year, and they were mostly seniors. And the reason why we started with seniors, we thought, well, you have to be a senior in high school and having taken biology to kind of understand this, the teaching of molecular biology and genetics. And in fact now, that was a complete mistake. We found out that it's much better to start in 7th grade and teach them very sophisticated stuff. So the stuff in 1988 we were teaching seniors, we're now teaching 7th grade kids. And the advantage of that is that the 7th grade kids know more about the biology, and they go into high school with a very substantial knowledge of biology, and that pushes the teachers to actually learn this stuff as well and advance their teaching. We have helped start DNA Learning Centers. We have 3 DNA Learning Centers in New York City area, in the New York metropolitan region. One in Harlem, which primarily focuses on minority students, and I'll mention that in a minute. But just in the DNA Learning Centers that we've helped start, there are 2 in Singapore, there's 1 in Australia, there's 1 in Vienna, there's 1 in South Carolina. We've started them around Boston, San Francisco. This teaches around about 120,000 students a year, and these are laboratory-based courses where kids come into the laboratories, do laboratory science, which is really directed by them, and then go back to their schools and take these courses that are all focused on integrating into the state curriculum so that they're required to pass this curriculum. So far, there's nearly 1 million students that have taken these courses since the Learning Centre started, and it's a very, very big program. Now, I mentioned that we have one in Harlem, and that's particularly interesting because in Harlem, and demographics are that only about 2% of the students that come to that particular school, which is on 120th Street and First Avenue in New York City, only 2% of them are Caucasian. So we're teaching African Americans, Hispanic, and Asian students, and the majority, actually, slight majority, 52% on average of these are girls. And one of the programs that we had the idea of doing, along with some other institutions in New York and Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory DNA Learning Center, raised the money and got this off the ground, was called the Urban Barcode Project. And this project is a really interesting phenomenon, and I think actually really should go national because it is the most effective way of teaching science I've ever seen. What we challenged kids who had never done real science before is we asked them to form teams. They could be teams of 1, 2, or up to 5 kids from New York City schools. So this was initially in New York City. And we asked them to go and collect stuff and then do a DNA analysis on this stuff. So the only criteria is the stuff had to have DNA in it, but they could figure that out. And then they had to isolate the DNA, and they had to come up with some hypothesis of what the stuff they were going to collect and why they wanted to collect it. Then they collected the stuff, isolated DNA themselves. We got it sequenced, and then we gave the information back to them, and they had to then use this DNA sequence to test their hypothesis or do whatever they wanted to do, and then write a report and give a presentation. In the first year, we had 87 teams do this from very diverse schools around New York City, and they went out and collected things like sushi in sushi restaurants and supermarkets. One team, believe it or not, even collected bed bugs from the Department of Health that came originally from New York City hotels, because the hypothesis was, are all the bed bugs genetically related or from different parts of the world? Because New York is, you know, where people come from all over the place to hotels. Another collected ginkgo products, advertised as having the Chinese herbal medicine ginkgo in it, and they wanted to find out if in fact it did. Others collected samples from Central Park. I mean, there was a very, very diverse series of sample collections. And they analyzed these DNAs, and of course the group that did sushi found out that in fact a lot of restaurants are selling dyed tilapia as really salmon or something else, that the salmon is not really salmon. The team that won this competition, we had a series of judges, and there was the best 16 teams presented at the Natural History Museum, which for these kids was a big deal. And then the team that won was the one that did the ginkgo project, and they won a $10,000 prize. And this was a team from the Bronx, and those kids, there were 3 kids in that team, had never done any science before. And one of the girls said to me when I was there to present the awards, said, I had never been interested in science before, but now I know more about DNA than my teacher does. And she had to go and, you know, find out about DNA. And it struck me that this experience-based learning is probably the best way to teach science, and is something now we want to expand considerably. That initial program was supported by the Sloan Foundation, and we want to raise additional monies, not from the Sloan Foundation, but from other groups to expand that. And I think if that was a national program, it could be really quite good, because I think it does expose kids to something, and you know, they get excited about this. So the DNA Learning Center, obviously in terms of thinking about gender, we have the philosophy, or at least I have the philosophy, is that we want to teach science to all kids. This is not a selective program. It's not for those who want to go and win Westinghouse or Intel or whatever the current programs are, because those kids are already good. And in fact, if you read what they win, they're pretty sophisticated projects that are going on in research universities in which these kids show up in a laboratory and get involved in this project, and they know a lot about it, but these kids are already motivated to do science. Our goal is to teach everybody in a class, and so we do not take selective students, we take the entire lot. And so from thinking about getting young girls interested in science, if you go to school and you're in one of these schools that have access to a learning center, you go to the program because that's part of the program. And so I think that's a great way of trying to induce in children an interest in science. As I said, the Learning Center is now expanded. The governor of Singapore came around the United States and was looking at high school programs in universities and various institutions. And when they saw our program, they said, we want 2 of them in Singapore, and they built it in 2 years. And they're now teaching more students than we do at Cold Spring Harbor. So authoritarian governments can do things pretty quickly. The next level up is undergraduate students, and we are not an undergraduate teaching university or an institution, but we have had an undergraduate research program since 1959. I think it's one of the oldest in the country. David Baltimore was in the first class, and so we claim that we taught him everything he knows. That program is very successful. In the last data I have for that there's about 50-50 young men and young women who take that program. It's actually in 2011 it was 46% men, 54% women, and I think that is probably just generally reflecting the undergraduates in universities. And we get about 800 applications for 26 slots at Cold Spring Harbor, and there are many programs now at universities that are similar to that. I think it's another good way, but again, this is a highly selective program for students who are interested in science. We try to take about half the students from colleges that are not research universities, and therefore don't have the opportunities to do very advanced laboratory-based research, as you might imagine you would do if you were in a Stanford University, for instance. And those kids turn out to be incredibly highly educated and very motivated to work hard during the summers. The next level up is graduate education, and we had a lot of graduate students working at Cold Spring Harbor from visiting universities, and in fact still do. We have about 110 graduate students on our campus. We only have 50 faculty, and that has doubled since I've become director in 1994. So we're not a big institution in terms of the number of laboratories, but we have 110 graduate students on the campus. And now, and most of those in the old days used to come from other universities. And but in 1998, we decided we were going to start a graduate program. And that was very interesting because Joan Stites and Shirley Tillman were on our board of trustees at that time. And Shirley was completely adamant that we do not start a graduate program because she was chair of a National Academy Committee that was looking into the fact that there were too many graduate students. Not the most recent one she was chair on, but back the Academy Committee then. And when we explained to her what we were trying to do, I think she became a very strong supporter of it. And in fact, she was recently chair of the Biomedical Workforce Committee and for the National Institutes of Health, co-chair with Sally Rocky. And tomorrow they're going to announce some of the recommendations and implementation of some of the recommendations from that committee. Our Dean of Graduate School, Lemore Joshua Tor, she was on that committee, and the graduate school that we started in 1999, after we got permission to grant degrees, And now we have about 54 students of the 110 that are Cold Spring Harbor students. We went around the country and looked at graduate schools and graduate programs in various universities, and also had experiences. I got my PhD in 3 years, and so did Jim Watson. And so we were very keen to try and have our students accelerate through graduate school faster than the typical average of 6 to 7 years in many universities. The problem in career development is when you're doing a graduate work for 6 years and then you go and do a postdoc, which is typical for 5 years, you're well into your mid-career before you're even thinking about getting a job. And that is just unacceptable, I think, and is a real problem in the biological sciences. One of the things that Shirley's committee pointed out in the biomedical workforce report was that the life sciences, unlike all of the other sciences, physics and chemistry in particular and engineering, the life sciences is still a growing science in terms of the number of people coming into it. And whereas chemistry and physics and engineering are rather mature fields, and therefore the number of people coming in is about equal to the number of people going out, and there's not a huge gap between undergraduate and getting a job. But in the life sciences, that is an enormous gap, which I think is unacceptable and way too long. And that's reflected in the age of the average age of getting your first NIH grant, which is something like 42 or 43 for MDs. So we started a graduate program with the goal of graduating students in 4 years. And that's been now running, and their first students graduated in 2004, so we've had about 8 years of experience, and the average is about 4.5 to 4.7 years for graduation. Some of the students have graduated in 3 years, and some take as long as 5 years, but we don't have students going much longer than that. We only take 8 to 10 students a year, so the statistics are not huge, but we already have, so the first students only graduated in 2004, and already we have 12 of those students who have tenure-track positions in universities. And we have one who has an independent research position in a research institute. 27 of them are postdoctoral fellows, and the other 8 have gone into industry or into foundations, and in either administrative positions or working in industry. And there's one person who decided to go to India to become a photographer, and one is a stay-at-home mum. But the rest of them are in science, and I think this speaks to the fact that you can actually go through graduate school relatively quickly and do fairly well, and end up been successful. In fact, 3 of the graduate students have been offered faculty positions straight out of graduate school. And part of the reason for that is that I think they got a lot of high visibility, and they were really fantastic students. And we have a policy at Cold Spring Harbor of hiring people straight out of graduate school. Carol Greider was one of those that I hired from Berkeley straight out of graduate school. And she had actually applied to my lab to do a postdoc, and when I was talking to her, every second word out of her mouth was telomerase, and I said, "You're not really interested in what I do. You're interested in telomerase." And she said, "Yes." And I said, "Well, why don't you work on that?" And she was, so that's what happened. But we've hired many, probably around about 20% of our faculty we've hired straight out of graduate school. And I think if somebody's really good, they don't need to go and spend 5 years in a lab doing a postdoc, but you have to be very careful because you can ruin someone's career by giving them too much too soon. But in our graduate, the accumulated numbers in our graduate school is around about 55% men and 45% women. That's small numbers, but it's probably about the statistic 50-50, which is reflecting about, I think, the undergraduate population. Of course, we have a postdoctoral fellow program and have long had a postdoctoral fellow program, and in that program we're starting to see a little bit of gender bias, but there's only 162 postdocs right now at Cold Spring Harbor, and 60% are men and 40% women. We do have, I think, some interesting career development programs, and many universities do. But what we did was we created a postdoctoral liaison committee that is an elected group of the postdocs. They elect this group, and there's deliberate turnover on this committee. And they are charged with coming up with ideas about career development. And they've done some really quite remarkable things, and we fund this. We give them money to be able to do this. They've developed two programs. One they call the Career Development Program, and this is for postdocs who want to go into an academic career. And they, in addition to doing their postdoc, they get full training in how to write grants, how to apply for a job, how to give a chalk talk, how to give a formal talk, how to think about managing people, which is what a lot of scientists have to do, and how to do to respond to having your paper trashed by some anonymous reviewer or reviewers, and dealing with this enormous long list of requirements that we're required to do to get a paper published these days. And so how to deal with editors and things like that. And so they get that's a whole program that's really training people, training postdocs for hopefully the opportunity of then going in to get in their own laboratory. So that's the career development program focused on an academic career. The other one is the Bioenterprise Club. And this was a very interesting one, which is actually jointly run by the graduate school, the graduate students, and the postdoctoral liaison committee. And they bring in speakers from very diverse careers of journalism, law, business, pharma industry, biotech, consulting industry, government, and foundations. And the idea is to really think about how one could use a science degree in very innovative ways. And some of those people, two of our graduate students who took that course went out and started a company, which Cold Spring Harbor helped them do. And that company is actually quite successful. And they're up and running, and they raised about $5 million in venture capital in the first round. So it's this is two graduate students, and it was all came through this Bioenterprise Club. It's anecdotal, but I think this was in the second year that they actually started the Bioenterprise Club, so I think it kind of is working. So the next level up is our meetings and courses. And one of the unique things about Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory is we have conferences and we teach science to scientists. And I got some data about this. This is run by David Stewart with help from Terry Grotziker. Terry Grotziker is the editor of Genes and Development, but also has been the Dean of Academic Affairs at Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory since I've been director, so that's 18 years. And back in 1992, when I took over as assistant director, 68% of the meetings attendants were men and 32% were women. That was in 1992. In this year, it's ended up now down to 60% men and 40% women, and I think that and the attendance distribution is really across the board from faculty all the way to graduate students. What's interesting, and the biggest change, has been meetings organizers, and Carla has participated both as a course organizer and a meetings organizer. And in 1992, when I took over, 83% of the meetings organizers were men, and now we're down to 60%, which is reflective of the people who are coming to the meetings. That has been we've tried to incorporate women as meetings organizers, and I think that's very important for the following reason. The way Cold Spring Harbor meetings are run is that the organizers choose who's going to speak, and having women participate as organizers is very important, I think, in terms of and these are not necessarily PIs, these are the graduate students and the postdocs, and I think that's very important in encouraging the ability to of having women speak at meetings, and that leads to jobs and things like that. In the Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory courses, we teach courses for 2 weeks or 3 weeks where people come to Cold Spring Harbor in residence and they take a course in advanced technologies. And again in 1992, a full 88% of the people who took courses, did course instruction were men. That's now down to 70%, and we're finding it very, very difficult to convince women to come and spend 3 weeks at Cold Spring Harbor to teach courses, although we've been very proactive in that. However, of the course trainees, it's completely opposite. 55% of them are women scientists this year, and that's up from 41% in 1992. So most of the people coming and taking the courses, or not most, but 55% of them are women. And I think this is, these courses really retrain people and also give scientists a window on a technology or a particular area of science that gives them, I think, a leg up. And we've actually had many people who have gone on to win the Nobel Prize in the field in which they took a course. Bob Horvitz took 3 courses at Cold Spring Harbor. Rod McKinnon took a course and then later taught that course on ion channels. And even Shinya Yamanaka came and took a course on how to clone DNA at Cold Spring Harbor. And he, of course, won the Nobel Prize this year. So I think this advanced education, I think, is a way of retraining or thinking about how you can get a leg up on trying to get a job. But as you all know, the biggest problem is at the faculty level, and at Cold Spring Harbor we're no different than, and probably a little bit worse than everybody else. We have 20% of our faculty are women, and that's not through want of trying to recruit women into that program. Now, what's an interesting statistic, we only have 50 faculty, but we also have 40, we call them faculty, who are what we call staff scientists. These are people who have positions, but they don't have to get grants. They are scientists who are long-term employees, who are PhDs, have done postdocs, and have positions at Cold Spring Harbor and work in the laboratories of our faculty. And we have 40 of them, and 50% are women. And it's interesting that a lot of women choose to go into that percentage-wise, choosing or are not getting the jobs and therefore take this. I don't know what's happening. But it's an interesting thing, and I think this, I'm going to finish up with the following. To try and induce, to try and make it easier for women, one of the things we did is to put an on-grounds childcare facility. And actually Carol Greider was responsible for that. We had a discussion at Cold Spring Harbor about what we were going to do to put a sports complex, and Jim Watson said, you know, well, we need a squash court or something like that, and asked Carol, because Carol was into sports, to chair a committee to recommend what sports complex we should have. And Carol came back and said, childcare centre. And it was a very interesting lesson, because I think if Jim had have asked a male scientist to chair that committee, we would have had a squash court or basketball court. But now we have a very fantastic childcare facility. It was all because Carol chaired that committee. And it's very, very helpful. And the other thing is that we have on-grounds housing, and I preferentially give access to women faculty who have children to live on the grounds, because it makes it a lot easier for them. But having said all of that, I think one of the biggest problems, and this came up in earlier discussions, is the current state of science and science funding. Being a scientist these days is not a pleasant experience for anybody. It's not a pleasant experience for me. I renewed both of my grants this year and then got 20% cut, and now I can't do the science that I said I was going to do, and so I have to worry about that, getting the grants renewed next time. And that's true for everybody. And with funding levels down at they are, the graduate students and the postdocs, and in the discussions we've had with the postdocs particularly about this, they are acutely aware of this environment that is going on. And I think this is not just true for women scientists, I think it's true for all scientists. And it's not just true for young scientists, although I'm very concerned about young scientists because I think we have the opportunity of losing a very large number of really talented people. But the reality is, as Shirley Tillman's Workforce Committee pointed out, there are a lot more people coming into biology and the biomedical sciences than are leaving it. And therefore, we are having a crisis in the number of people looking for jobs. If those people get jobs, there's a crisis in getting grants. And even senior people, and I know many of them, have chosen to just basically stop applying for grants. And some have left academia and decided to retire, and others, in fact, my first, and I actually was horrified at this, my first graduate student has decided to give up. He was actually a very successful and is now a full professor at a medical school, and has basically just decided it's not worth it anymore. And that is very sad because he was a great scientist and is a great scientist. And I think one of the things that we really need to be focused on in this discussion about fiscal cliff and sequestration and all of those things is not that, because that'll be resolved. And whether it's resolved by them coming to some ridiculous compromise between now and January, or them delaying it, which will probably happen for a period of time, and then we'll have this discussion all over again, which I hope doesn't happen. Or even if they resolve it, it's not going to increase the funding for NIH. And the reality is that we've lost around about 17% of spending power in NIH funding since 2003. I'm on the board of advisors of the National Cancer Institute, and the National Cancer Institute is one of the toughest institutes to get grants now, and they're talking about the gray zone between 7 and 9% percentile funding. This is really disgusting, and I think the scientific community and organizations that, the research societies and other organizations that are focusing on science are so focused on this fiscal cliff, they're missing the big picture here. And the big picture is economic development for the future of the country, and the other big picture is the loss of a whole generation of scientists that I think we need to begin to focus on. And I think there needs to be a serious discussion of how we're going to move forward. The discussion doesn't have to be to go to your politicians and increase funding, because I don't think in this climate it's going to happen. I think the discussion needs to be, how can institutions better support their own science? At Cold Spring Harbor, and this is an amazing thing, less than 50% of our research support comes from the federal government. Less than 50%. When I became director, it was around about 68%. There are other independent research, and I've looked at this data, other independent research institutes out there where 80 to 85% of their research is supported by federal grants. And they are in real serious trouble because of this competition for grants now. We have been very proactive, and we need to do this more, of increasing private support for our research. And so we have an extraordinarily large amount of private support for science, either through endowment or through annual fundraising or for long-term grants from foundations. That is buffering our scientists. The other thing is that the startup packages for scientists has gone way up since I started science. I had zero startup package. I was basically a postdoc, and then the next thing I was a faculty member, and I still had the same bench that I had when I was a postdoc, but I got another bench, and I then had to eventually recruit somebody to that bench. And then it grew from there. But that was what it was like in those days. The startup packages now cost us around about $4 million per faculty member if you take indirect cost into account. And that is the reality of making sure that scientists that we recruit have the resources to be able to get to the stage in the first 5 years, or whether they can actually really make it or not. And that is something that I think a lot of medical schools and institutions just are not really focused on, although the best institutions are providing, I know we're competing with them, providing high starter packages. But here's another thing that's going to happen, and I suspect this will be discussed tomorrow. The NIH is going to have to look into cutting back the support that they provide to a lot of scientists at the moment. And the one thing that they've already started doing is salaries. Medical schools are basically business modeled on the recovery of 100% salary or a large percentage of salary. Even universities, where there's 9 months salary provided, supposedly provided to the faculty, universities say, well, get 50% of your salary from grants. The NIH is going to push this down. They've already reduced the cap, as you know, the salary cap. Most people are not paid the NIH salary levels that are recommended. They're paid above that. And the NIH last year reduced, or the Congress actually reduced the amount, the cap from $197,000 down to $176,000, and it's likely to go down again. And if it keeps going down, we're going to find out that actually a very, very small percentage of one salary, faculty salaries, are going to be paid for by the NIH, and I think, and perhaps by the NSF as well. And I think that is going to be a reality, and institutions are going to have to wake up and really think about how many faculty can they really truly support. Because I think we've been in an era, particularly through the doubling of the NIH, when there's been a huge expansion in the amount of space that is available, and now universities are going to have to pay for that space, but we've run into this kind of our own fiscal cliff, if you will. So as I think in the future, one of the things, and this is what I'll finish on, is that I think as a community, we are all going to have to think about what is the future of how science is going to be funded. And I think institutions are going to be asked to pay a lot more than they were in the past. And this will either go back to the era before there was NIH funding, when a lot of it came from foundations and private support, or there'll be hopefully a recognition by the federal government that there's going to have to be sustained and predictable increases in the NIH so that we can actually plan. Because the way things are at the moment, I don't think any scientist can plan anything beyond the next 6 months or even 12 months because they just don't know what's going on. So with that gloomy note, I think that there is great opportunities in the future for women and for men scientists if the current scientists all get together and try to really try to resolve this. And it's not just, we should be beating on our members of Congress to increase funding, but I think we have to really start to have a conversation about the future of the infrastructure of science. And we should be leading that. We should not be told by Congress how that happens, and that's what's happening now. So thank you very much.
I have a question.
Yes.
We just started to talk about it briefly, but when you look at what Wellcome and Howard Hughes and Max Planck are doing, becoming a publisher, they are putting some of their money into a publishing endeavor. Given the fact that even as a publisher, I say the world does not need another journal, even though I love to create them. Do you think that's was that a good use of their money? Did they do it because they think that there wasn't enough good places, or do you think they did it to increase profitability for their primary goal?
Well, so the question was from Mary Notes about publishing. So Howard Hughes, Max Planck, and the Wellcome Trust have started a new journal called ELife, which they've put a very substantial amount of money into, which could have gone into research. And is that a good thing, since that there are lots of journals out there and lots of publishers who are doing it? And I'm on as it says in my bio, I've been on the medical advisory board of the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, and Carla was on this before as well, and there was a lot of discussion at that board meeting about this. This was an idea that actually arose out of the Wellcome Trust from Mark Walpert, and then they recruited Hughes and the Max Planck Society. And it was really a reaction to the fact that Hughes are now spending a very large amount of money on publishing papers in journals, particularly what they call the top three, the CNS journals, they're paying a large amount of money, and those papers are not open access, and they felt that there was a need for another vehicle to publish the highest competitive science in a journal, and that was the genesis of ELife. The amounts of money that they're spending are not in the whole scheme of things, between the Wellcome Trust and Max Planck and Hughes, the amount of money they're spending for the journal is a large amount of money, but it's not a big percentage of their total spend. I think it was done to try and change the mindset, and I think what was really driving it was that if you look at most of the journals, the people who are making the decisions about what papers are published are not scientists. They've never run a laboratory for most part. These are people who have gone through and trained as scientists but never run a lab. They don't know how much experiments cost, and and this is scientists' fault. I mean, we're scientists, and I don't review journal papers anymore. I don't have time, but scientists review papers. I get reviews back, and they give you a list of things to do, and sometimes they'll say do a whole genome sequence on 40 different samples. Well, that costs a huge amount of money, and an editor who has never run a lab doesn't have a clue how much that costs. And you try to petition them and say, well, wait a minute, this is going to cost $100,000 to do this experiment, and they don't care. They really don't care. So one of the incentives for starting ELife was actually to take it back to get scientists to review science and get it done quickly. So their turnaround time is supposedly about 3 weeks, and that seems to be working as far as I've heard. And the idea is that these are scientists who are making decisions, and they're scientists who are writing the editorial decision, and that is made available to all of the editors so that they can see what that editor is making a decision on. So I think it's a good system, but there are society journals like Molecular and Cellular Biology, it just comes to mind, but there are lots of them, who are run by societies who also have scientists as editors. But I don't think those editors have putting in the time that the ELife people paid to do. They're paid a lot of money to do this, and so they are putting in the time to do it. And so we'll wait and see. It's an experiment, and of course it won't cover, it's going to cover a minuscule number of papers. And so it's not going to have an impact on publishing at all unless ELife goes the same way as PLOS did and start publishing, ELife this and that and everything else. And then, we'll wait and see how that happens, whether that happens or not. But the number of papers they're publishing so far is very, very small, and it's not having a big impact. Yeah.
So my question is, sort of, I was sitting here thinking, as I've heard a lot of the doom and gloom about the fiscal cliff, and we need to get, more money for science, and that's frustrating because we don't control that. So I was trying to think about what do we control, and I wonder if anybody's thought about, our research efficiency. The models of how we run our labs, how we structure the culture of, apprenticeship graduate students is very much single PI, your own domain. Everybody's got all of their own equipment. There's some sharing. But I wonder if this decrease in the budget, we might rethink some of our cultural attitudes, which were really laid in the 1950s and 60s when science was a very different place, and through that be able to, maybe make a better science and also do it, I hate to say it, for less money because nobody can imagine that, but perhaps there are opportunities there.
So I think it's a very good point because, and I think it really depends upon where you are. I think the research-intensive universities have figured out some of that by creating shared resources. At Cold Spring Harbor, we have no equipment that's owned by anybody, and everything is shared, everything. And we have shared resources, shared facilities that are run by PhD level people who, and this costs the institution a lot of money, but this is the way the institution has been running a long time, and it's very efficient. And I think per capita we get a big bang for the buck. We're rated #1 in the world in molecular biology and genetics, and I think there's a good reason why that is the case. However, I don't know how people in universities who are predominantly teaching/research universities that are in a department where I know, because we had a meeting at our Banbury Centre on this, we brought in a whole bunch of department chairs and asked them, and we discussed what do they do when a faculty member doesn't get a grant, and the resources they have is about $50,000 to give them, to keep them, you know, moving ahead. That's just not enough. At Cold Spring Harbor, we have not shut down any laboratory that has not got a grant. We've fully funded those laboratories, and it's becoming increasingly difficult to do so, but that's what we've done. And so the people have a higher probability of staying in science. And so, and as I said before, I know a lot of very, very talented scientists who are saying, you know, after 2 or 3 rounds of this, they're just giving up. And it's not just the grants. I think we're shooting ourselves in the foot by the way that we review journals and things like that. I mean, the physicists do it a lot better than we do it. And I think we've got to start to learn about other mechanisms of publishing. At the moment, there are way too many papers in biology, and to be able to publish like the physicists do. So I think we have to have a discussion about how we manage our lives, and our lives are consumed by arguing with reviewers and trying to get grants and dealing with committees in your institution and all that. And how much time do you actually have to sit down and really think about science? Now, we have a lot of people at Cold Spring Harbor who will refuse to be on a committee, and so it makes my life a lot more difficult, but we have hired people to actually manage the science, but we can afford to do that. You can't do that in universities because you don't have the resources, unless you can convince the dean to give you those resources. So I think the whole infrastructure, and I agree with you, and the National Cancer Institute has discussed this. They have a cancer centers program, and we have discussed at the board meeting about having shared resources. That is that, you know, why couldn't Sloan Kettering and Cold Spring Harbor and Columbia University, each of which have a cancer center, start sharing expensive shared facilities like proteomics, for instance, and we're in discussions about that. So I agree with you, but this is something that if we don't do anything about this, the community, we're going to be told to do it, and we will be scrambling very rapidly. Yes?
Can I just add to that? One of the things that faculty have an opportunity to do now is to look again at opportunities that are available at national using facilities. So at PNNL, there's Environmental Molecular Sciences Laboratory. It's proposal-based competition. Basically, if your proposal is selected, access to the equipment is free. You pay your travel there and back. And so, yeah, it's a great way to leverage whatever money you do have to get some great high-impact science done.
So you all have a charge to go back and organize, and I think that's. I mean, I come from Australia, and here's an interesting thing that happened there, which I think would never happen in the United States because we're too balkanized. The federal government proposed to cut back there are 2 large equivalents in Australia, equivalents of NIH and NSF. And the federal government announced, or leaked, they didn't announce, they leaked that they were going to cut back by about 7% the funding for these 2 large agencies. That rumor shot around the scientific community, and the National Academy in Australia organized regional, around the country in the major cities, protests, and they had thousands and thousands and thousands of scientists in front of the government offices the very next day blocking off city streets and complaining that the government was going to cut science, and this was all based on a leak. I mean, you know what happens in politics, they leak things, policy, just to see how they're going to, and see what happens. Well, this is what the scientists did. They basically shut down the cities. So the government reversed their policy before they even announced the policy. This would never happen in the United States. The National Academy, I think, is too chicken to do that because they're funded by Congress. And so who is going to do it? We have a very diverse set of research societies that are all doing all sorts of different things. But imagine if that could happen in the United States. And I don't see who would do that in the United States. But there's one organization that's really central in Australia, and that is the Academy, and they orchestrated this, and it happened. And it really, you know, these days with social media, you can do things very, very rapidly, and that's what happened. So I think those are the types of things that we have to start thinking about, is to mobilize the entire community and get round the apathy that exists here. And there's a huge amount of apathy among scientists. Yeah.
Sense a little bit of dissonance in what you said. With great pride, you talked about educating younger and younger students, exposing them to science, getting them excited about science. We have a concern about being able to actually support a large science enterprise in this country.
Yep.
You expressed disappointment in your first student who's not going to be continuing as a scientist. The dissonance that I'm feeling is we do want to have more people in this country who know about the value of science and use science in everyday life.
Yep.
And recognize. So we read in the paper that there are so few scientists or scientifically knowledgeable members of Congress. So how can we expect them? So when you're speaking about the community, it's really a more ivory tower of the scientists need to get out of their ivory tower and make a case for why science is important. But I also think that an alternative strategy could be to think of those people who are no longer writing grants as potential ambassadors to be able to infiltrate the world with what's in the value of science and how science needs to be.
So I don't think there's a conflict there. Remember what I said at the school level. We decided right at the front not to be selective. And the reason we did that, and one of the reasons why the Learning Centre got started, the guy that started the Learning Centre was actually our head of public relations at Cold Spring Harbor, public relations. And he realized that the challenge is going to be, if they were going to educate the public about what we're doing in science, you've got to think about it as a generational thing and have everybody come through. And so that's why we started this Learning Centre, and that's why it was non-selective. Science is a Darwinian process. Like all things in life, you get selected to do this and this and this, and then you end up in positions where you're fortunate enough to be able to do science. That is always going to exist, and we have to give everybody an opportunity to, you know, this is America, so everybody has an opportunity to try and make it as a scientist if they will. And I absolutely agree with you. The rest of the people, the people that we are training, hopefully will, and I was interested in Dominique's comments about today about how much knowledge is valuable in societal decisions. I actually personally think it's very valuable to have not the detailed knowledge about, you know, stem cells or GM food, but about how to find out about the issue if you're interested in it and understand those issues, and you need to have some background in science to do that. So I think that's where we are. But at the levels that I'm talking about in terms of people who want to have science as a career, that is always going to be very, very highly, I hate to use the word competitive, but it's going to be highly selective. But it has to be, because that's what good science is about. Not everybody can do good science. You have to, A, have a passion for it. You have to want to spend all these hours going to graduate school and to, you know, work in labs and not have a social life and things that, you know, that scientists go through when they're postdocs and students, and even when they're faculty. And all of the stuff that I talked about, dealing with the issues about being a young faculty member, essentially running a company on your own, which is the nature, I mean, that's what was said before, it's the nature of being a scientist. Now, the more we can help those scientists do that by having shared this and that and all of the training and things like that, the better. But ultimately, we're not talking about the very few of us who get selected, who make it into science. We're talking about educating a larger, broader. And I absolutely agree with you. I mean, the Bioenterprise Club, we've had congressional staff people come to Cold Spring Harbor for meetings on policy, and then they've talked to the graduate students, like, you know, what it's like to work in Washington. And there are people I know who are scientists who work as congressional staffers. There's few members of Congress who are trained in science. Actually, interestingly, most of them physicists or physicians, but very few molecular biologists and chemists and things like that. Yeah.
Victorian, whether to actually bring this up, since you mentioned one of the realities of being in America is that there's a huge percentage of people in this country that just don't believe in biology.
Yes. Yes.
When you talked about where the DNA centers are located, I didn't hear sort of deep south.
Oh, no, we have one in Western South Carolina, Clemson University. So, it's deep. No, it's deep. But Clemson is a little island, and you go 5 miles from Clemson, you're in the real Bible Belt, I can tell you. Anyway.
So, you know, with there's like the Creation Museum, you've got tens of thousands, as many children as you're exposing to DNA, being exposed to very different cells.
Yeah.
I just wonder if somewhere in the strategy there's just embracing the fact that there is actually a scientific war taking place. But
Yeah.
it seems like the other side is already engaged in that, our side.
I think my own personal view is that I mean, America is a fundamentalist religious society, and that there's a lot of people who are very, very fundamentalist religious, and these are the people that we're talking about in terms of not believing in evolution. There's a large number of people who just don't understand evolution or science, and so that's one of the reasons why doing this education from the ground up is important. But the ones that are really fundamentally creationists, and even if not creationists, religious in the sense that they are wary of evolution, I think we're going to have a very hard time changing that in this country. What's amusing is that in other Western societies, Australia and Britain, there's not the big problem with evolution. There is a problem, but it's not as big as here. But they have bigger problems with GM food than we do here, and that's because of the way it was portrayed. I was actually at a meeting in Norway where this whole issue about the perception of genetically modified food was presented. And there was a guy who was a journalist from the BBC on Radio 4 who talked about this. And he talked about the week between the time when the American ship was turned around from France that was carrying corn oil to France. It was reported in France by a science reporter. That got picked up by a science reporter in London. And so this is a science reporter who knew what he was writing about. And the very next day, this got written by political reporters who didn't understand science at all. And in 4 days, there was this huge headline that says, "Blair eats Frankenfood," because Tony Blair came out and said that he supported genetically modified food. And this what Dominic presented today, this word frankenfood got splashed across the headlines. And he played a clip of a scientist, and this said a huge amount about the naivety of scientists. He played a clip on his radio show, Radio 4. They had a debate, and they had someone from the anti-GM food movement. And the scientist on there was trying to convince the public that eating contaminated food was good, because the anti-GM food guy said, well, this is contaminated with this regular corn oil is contaminated with GM produced corn oil. And instead of saying it's mixed or it's a mixture, the scientist said, well, the contaminated stuff is fine. And, you know, you're listening on the radio. I mean, to listen to this, and when he played it, it sounded completely ridiculous. But the guy is trying to tell the general public that eating contaminated food is fine. And it sounded nuts. But this is, you know, scientists get sucked into this thing. And the wording is very, very cleverly chosen. And I think that's another lesson that scientists need to have. So, yeah.
Just looked it up. This year, the creation of the museum will have 250,000.
Yeah, yes.
It's not a school.
Yes, well, this is what that Dominic said earlier today about getting science into popular culture. It is extremely difficult, and CSI is a commonly used example, but we know from our learning centers in Manhattan. There's a college called John Jay College. It's one of the biggest forensic colleges in the United States. You ask every kid who, you know, they come to the learning center, they do a DNA test of what do you want to be? They want to be a DNA detective. I mean, that's what they want to be. They don't think about science. They're thinking about, you know, being one of them. So we've got to get more scientists.
Do you have any figures yet about how many of them carry that through to majors or more?
Yeah, with the learning center's been running long enough that we know that we don't know that it's hard to track, and the reason why it's hard to track is we're not allowed to take the data from the schools and follow the kids. So it's somewhat anecdotal, but we actually, one of the African American teachers at the learning center was a student who came through the Cold Spring Harbor, came through the learning center years ago in the very early days. We know that there are scientists because they come back to Cold Spring Harbor and they say, oh, you know, I was at the learning center and I run into those people. But it is somewhat anecdotal. It's very hard to track schools because the schools won't allow us to keep the kids. Now, the ones that do sign up for the national database, DNA base, they have, or did have email addresses, but those are not necessarily always carried on to future life. So yeah, tracking scientists training is a big problem. Yep. We should finish up too. I'm taking too long.
Our few science museums across the country, they're also struggling for funding.
Yes.
And play a very important role in helping children learn about science, because the public schools or any of the schools aren't really equipped to be able to do as good a job as perhaps they'd like to do. And I'm just wondering how this is all going to play out, where the funding is being crunched at the top end and also at the end, even though your program is great to help children, it can only reach so many.
Yeah.
How are we doing as a nation, and where does this over for where we're going as a nation in science? So, again, the Howard Hughes have discussed this, and one thing they have done is that they completely, when Bob Tejan became president, and there was a lot of discussion about this early on, about completely revamping this spend. They spend about $80 million a year on science education. They have now started a television company. And they hired the president of National Geographic Television, who's now working for Howard Hughes. They've created a company. Sean Carroll was recruited, who's a very effective science educator, was recruited to be VP of Science Education at Hughes. And they are producing from television and film material that will eventually be shown nationally on television.
The other thing they've done is they've got, when you do 1 hour of NOVA, there's about 200 to 300 hours of film that goes behind that 1 hour of television. So they have taken all of that and digitized it, and they're making 3-minute vignettes that are available to school teachers. And so the school teacher comes into the school and shows, there's a really fantastic one about evolution, about mice that have light and brown coat color and a light coat color, and depending upon whether they live on a lava bed or in the desert, in the sand. These are genetically, ancestrally related animals, and they have mutation, single gene mutation that changes their coat color. And there's a little 3-minute video, and that's shown in the beginning of the classroom, and then the teacher teaches that class. And so this type of use of media is going to increase. The other thing is that ExxonMobil, talking about scaling, ExxonMobil have spent huge, probably the largest science education funding in the country, other than the governments, have spent a large amount of money on science teacher education. And so one of the sad things about it is in this country that if you get a degree in education, you don't get a degree in science, and if you get a degree in science, you're not trained on how to teach. And so they have funded programs around the country, and now quite a number of universities have programs where they're joint baccalaureate degrees, and so you get a joint degree in science and education. So you're now trained as an educator, which is important. My daughter's well, she now teaches teachers, but she was a teacher in the South Bronx, in the city schools, and you have to know how to teach kids if you're going to be in that environment. And this is why I think things like Teach for America have not done as well as they might, because those people that have come out of very, very good schools don't know how to handle kids in a classroom. On the other hand, the kids that went to education schools, got a degree in education, have not done science, they've not done lots of other things. So these joint baccalaureate degrees are actually very good, and ExxonMobil have been focusing on that. And I think that may actually have a help in the future, but and that's a big program. There's many, many thousands, I think tens of thousands of teachers that have graduated from those programs now. But that's something else we should encourage. Okay, thanks very much.